Good evening, everyone. My name's Malcolm Hackett and I chair the board of BRI. Welcome to our second webinar of our 2025 series, Landscaping for Bushfire. We have two outstanding presenters tonight, Owen Gooding and Andrew Laidlaw. Following their presentations, Owen and Andrew will provide a panel and a Q&A session. Our objective is to provide information to help you harden your garden for bushfire while retaining the enjoyment and pleasure of a garden. This series of presentations has been organised by Bushfire Resilience Inc., an independent, community-led not-for-profit. Our mission is to improve community engagement in reducing bushfire risk by providing expert knowledge and promoting it to households in a timely and practical manner. These webinars have been organised on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. BRI and our presenters acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands from which the presenters and you join us tonight, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples, their ongoing cultures and 65,000-year connection to the lands and waters across Australia. Please note that the webinars and the presenters are providing information. It's not advice. Our intention is to provide general information about risks to property, people and animals. It's your responsibility to seek advice for your particular situation. Bushfires may be a sensitive topic for some people. Suggested services are shown on the screen. We'd particularly like to thank our sponsors and supporters, the Bendigo Community Bank branches in our region, the Country Fire Authority, the Warrandyte Riverside Market, the City of Manningham, the Warrandyte Bridge over the Yarra, the Nillumbik Shire Council, Davey Pumps, the Resilient Canopy, a community resilience movement transforming Australia's response to social and climate challenges with communities at the helm. We're very grateful to our sponsors and our supporters for their ongoing support. Our presenters are industry experts. Owen was involved in the CFA's landscaping and bushfire project, bushfire planning, building regulation and planned burning. After the 2009 bushfires, he was a member of the team that researched house loss. Andrew Laidlaw, the landscape architect at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Melbourne. Andrew designed the Ian Potter Foundation Children's Garden and Guilfoyle's Volcano. He worked with the CFA to produce a guide on gardens in a bushfire setting and with traditional owners in developing an understanding of the deeper history of place. Owen will now begin his presentation. Thanks, Owen.
Good evening, everyone. The information we've got tonight is based on more than 40 years of fire research here in Australia and overseas. We also draw on many experiments that have been done on building materials and building assemblies and even whole buildings in simulated bushfires. Tonight, we'll draw on not only that research, but also the CFA resource called Landscaping for Bushfire. This was a project that came out of the Royal Commission of Victorian Fires in 2009. I want to begin with a bit of a context for fire in Australia, and that is we start with the landscape. Most of Australia burns from the top end through in the Mallee country and in the high altitude forests of Tasmania. It's a pretty universal Australian. And perhaps you're familiar with the cultural aspects of fire, so use of fire for ceremony, but there's also use of fire for medicine and food plants in caring for country. Our plants have evolved with fire. Some of you may have seen the grass trees flower after fire. The way the leaves are structured, the resins in the trunk, it's really well disposed to burning, and fire's always triggered a flowering event. And there's many common native species, the heath, the bush peas, the wattles, that all have a seed dormancy that fire can break. And many of our ephemeral natives, such as the Tylotus on the left and the spider orchid on the right, will benefit from having the competition from shrubs and grasses swept away by fire. It looks pretty bleak, and certainly the media will report about bush being destroyed or devastated. But these two photographs here in the series are exactly 12 months apart. And so we see the plants and animals do return. In animals in particular, it's very distressing to see them injured or die. But all the animals will return. They return at different times, at different rates, depending on their habitat needs. So if our flora and fauna have evolved, what's the nature of bushfire risk in the human context? And for me, there's the four physical parts there, the vegetation, which provides the fuel, the weather, which drives the fire behaviour, the climate, which underlies and influences the weather, but also soil moisture and therefore fire behaviour, and the geography of the land, which alters wind patterns and weather locally. But it's the land use, it's us living in these bushland areas that create a high risk environment. And before we delve into landscaping, it's really important to understand that it operates along with a whole bunch of other things we do for different states of fire. So the green column on the left shows things that we do to prevent ignition. Examples will be community education, fire danger period, power line maintenance. The next column, the orange, is the things that we do to stop a small fire becoming big and intense, and that's things like early detection and dispatching firefighting resources. The next column, well, these fires are going to become big and destructive, and we're trying to prevent them from claiming lives and property. And the way we do that is development or land use planning, the building standard for bushfire construction, but community education. On the right-hand side, we're going to have losses, and these are the things we do to try and minimise the long-term harm to community. And landscaping is in the blue column. It's assuming the fire is going to hit, and it's about hardening the house and the garden, to use the engineering terminology, to reduce losses. So I want to touch on fire behaviour quickly because it's illustrative of why we need to do things as a community. So these numbers here aren't important to remember, but at 4,000 kilowatts of energy per metre of fire front, firefighters can do a direct attack in a forest. At 10,000, they can tackle grass. But at 10,000, in the statistics, we see the house loss rapidly increase. And of course, many fires are much greater than that energy level. So the underlying message is there, we can't rely on suppression to prevent these big losses. As a community, we need to help ourselves. Fire intensity is generally thought of as fuel, topography, and weather. We will focus on fuel today because that's where we're in the garden space. By fuels, we mean trees, shrubs, grass, leaf litter, not so much the organic soils. But I would make the point that it's the house itself and what's around it that is also the fuels when the conditions are bad. It's really important to think about the attributes of the fuel. So people will talk about the size of the fuel, the fine fuel. That's the stuff that dries and wets quickly, that carries the flaming fire across the surface. They're important for our gardens. The next aspect is arrangement. So very compact fuels are difficult to ignite. But if you've got fuels that are continuous vertically or horizontally, fire can progress very easily. And the last one is moisture, which will affect how quickly things catch fire and therefore the rate of spread. When we're looking at forests, this will also work for our gardens. We're looking at elevated fuels, so the shrubs, the creepers, the bark on the trees, the surface litter, of course, and the near surface being those smaller plants that grow like the grasses. And a really good way to think about this, if nothing else, is to understand there's a correlation between the amount of energy coming off a fire, not only from the amount of fuel, but the type and its arrangement. Now, here we have a grass fire with flames from ankle height to perhaps hip height. This coastal scrub, if those shrubs are 4 or 5 meters high, you've got 3 times the flame length, so maybe between 12 and 15 meters of flame length. Massive increase of energy over the grass fuels. And then this is Black Saturday bunyip, where the whole forest is involved from the surface right into the crown. We also must talk about the bark in fire spread. So we have, in this picture here, you'll see particles of bark that are light and falling off. They will land and grow, and they'll grow together and coalesce and create a highly energetic fire way ahead of the surface fire. So fires are spreading by spotting, and it's coming from bark. A quick illustration of soil moisture. This is a grassland experiment that CFA did. The bottom 30 square meter grid is grass that is 30% cured. The top center is 70% cured. 100% cured means no moisture in it. Fires were lit at the same time. 30% cured is not even a quarter of the way across the grid, whereas the 70% has reached the end, and the flame lengths are very, very different. So it's just a good illustration of the role of moisture. On the subject of topography, we have it affecting wind direction, wind speed, also the moisture content in the soil and the plants, and therefore the productivity of the plants. It's creating very local weather effects. It also runs fast uphill and downhill, so there's a big influence from topography. To house loss, 3 mechanisms are recognised: flame contact, radiant heat, and ember. And all the studies here and everywhere else all come to the same conclusion. But mostly ember attack. So what are we going to do about that? So the broad concept is the house will generally survive if the fire intensity is low to moderate in the immediate area around it. It's thought of as that function of the siting of the building and the fuel management. So siting meaning how far is the house from unmanaged vegetation, usually forest. What's the slope underneath that fuel? Where is the house above or below that fuel? And the fuel management is our garden, our landscape. We also have the advantage of experiments to test building elements, what tolerance they have for the bushfire radiation. And from those tests, we know what sort of distances we need to provide an acceptable level of radiation. And in turn, these inform our regulation response to the bushfire problem. So across Australia, Australian Standard 3959 for bushfire construction, but also the planning controls. I think in New South Wales, it might be called development controls. It's those situations where a permit is required under legislation. So they both deal with amber attack and radiation, slightly different ways. But the thing is, whether it's a new house or an old house, all homes benefit from the property preparation, the landscaping. And here's a quick illustration of the effects of the garden. This is from Black Saturday in St Andrews. The paint is blistered, the glass has cracked. That's the radiation from the garden. Fortunately, the window didn't fail. If it failed, of course, the embers have entry into the curtains and carpets, and then you have a house fire. In this case, the owners benefited from having separation between the wall of the house and the garden. The gravel providing no fuel up against the building. Hidden out of view, though, is a sleeper retaining wall, which smouldered for days and days and days and kept the owners busy with buckets of water. Not great. So to the resource we're going to draw on tonight, and it'll be a resource for people to refer to later on. CFA produced this booklet and a plant selection key, not a list of plants, more on that later. And it's available as a book and online. Applies to new and old. And we're going to reduce the house loss in a bushfire from garden design and plant selection. This is a snapshot of the online plant selection key, so I encourage people to play with this to determine the flammability of a plant you're looking at that's in the garden or one you're thinking about. The overall objective is to reduce the likelihood of house loss by creating defendable space. And the how is we manipulate the hard and soft, so not just the plants, it's the hard landscaping. And we'll be able to eliminate direct flame contact. We can reduce the radiation to an acceptable level, and we can do something about the total ember load on the house. First principle, defendable space. It's called defensible space in American. Different names in different jurisdictions, but they all have the same objective. They all have very similar sizes. Asset protection is sometimes called. The second principle is the act of looking around the house, analysing what can become fuel. So it can be things that are on a veranda, it can be the deck itself, it can be the carport, it can be the pergola. These are vulnerabilities to the vulnerable parts of our house that can bring fire into it. So if we can remove those, we should be doing that. This is the most important principle. It's the separation idea, or we're breaking up fuel continuity. Our second speaker, Andrew, will recognise the drawing. His organisation produced these for the CFA book, and it's showing a model garden that's been put together using the design principles and the plant selection. I won't dwell too much on this. I think Andrew will touch on it. But you would notice that immediately around the house is concrete and paving. The next level of protection is the short green grass. Then there's a series of garden beds with small plants, all separated by footpaths. And as you progress out, there are taller flammable objects, but each is separated by lawn or paths. Quick illustration of fire entering into a house. So on the right, we have some small shrubs that caught embers. You'll notice the fire didn't progress to the lawn, so it was embers getting into the shrubs. The shrubs caught fire, generated their own embers, but they also set fire to the barge boards of this veranda. And the fire progressed through those into the joists and up the posts. In this case, a neighbour popped in to see how this house was going, spotted the fire, and you wouldn't believe it, they managed to hail down a fire truck. But if that truck didn't turn up, that garden would have caused that house loss. An example from the same fire, but this one wasn't impacted. It just demonstrates some separation. So we have the gravel to break up the fuel continuity. We have the slashed grass area, and in the background is the unmanaged vegetation. The fourth one deals with trees selection location. So trees should be retained if it's safe to do so. They moderate the strong winds that come with bushfires. They also can provide a little bit of radiation shielding to nearby assets. What you do is you have a space between the canopies, so thinning if it's existing, but certainly planting with enough room for the canopies to not be touching. Importantly, separation of the fuels underneath. So under pruning the lower branches to about 2 meters, keeping your shrubs away from underneath them, and a bit of maintenance. Trees are good. It's got to be smart about selection, location, and maintenance. So our flammability depends on a bunch of things. The first group of stuff is the physical attributes of the plant, age, structure, chemical content, etc. But it depends on the time of day and the season, how much moisture is in it, and therefore how flammable it is, how quickly it ignites, if you like. Importantly, it's the location of that plant in relation to other flammable objects of other plants, but also hard landscaping. And depends on parts of the plant. Some plants have really good bark, but they might have leaves that aren't, or structures that aren't so good. So it depends on which part of the plant you're looking at. And the way landscaping for bushfire runs an assessment is you're asked to look at the branching pattern first. On the left, we have branching low to the ground, very, very densely packed branching. The surface fire will happily get into that and consume the whole plant. On the right, the white cedar has branches that are well and truly off the ground and lots of spaces between the branching nodes. So the fuel particles are held further apart. The second and third set of questions look at texture and density. And essentially what we're trying to do is assess the amount of fine fuel and how close it is. It then asks about the leaf type. Small, thin leaves will ignite very readily, whereas the larger leaves and the succulent leaves, much more energy required to get them going. Remembering the spotting activity, the importance of embers in the house loss. In your bushfire smart garden, you would avoid the loose fibrous barks or the stringy barks. Can't do anything about the broader landscape, but in our garden, let's not add those ember sources. You go for tightly held barks like the sycamore or the ironbark. We then look at oils and waxes. These plants will catch fire more readily than those that don't. And lastly, you should look at how much dead material is retained inside the plant underneath it. So that's the flammability assessment from the book. It's really important to remember, though, it's not just the plants. It's also about the role of hard landscaping in house loss, so fire propagating through decks, retaining walls, garden edging, furniture. The hard stuff's really important. And I re-emphasize again the critical importance of the fuel continuity, of breaking up that continuity of fuel vertically and horizontally. And that's in the design, which Andrew will talk about, but it's also in the maintenance. A couple of case studies before I finish to show you what the gardens might look like, more importantly, some of the practical tips. This case study is from the Victorian Goldfields. The couple had built a fire smart house and wanted a garden to complement it. And they achieved that through using separation by virtue of gravel paths and paving, and the selection of low flammability plants, especially succulents. And if you look at the aerial view, you'll notice the garden beds are narrow and each is separated by the gravel paths. And there's a further separation at the back with the slash grass before it reaches the unmanaged bushland. Two examples of things we haven't really emphasized enough in this journey about landscaping so far: the role of radiation shields. This is the Mickleham-Kilmore fire. This is only colour bond. The fire was on the right, but look at the protection for the garden on the left. It has 100% shielded all the radiation. We might use that where protecting a house or a water tank or other structure. The second thing I think we've neglected is the green breaks. This house had fire in the forest on three sides. The surface fire from the forest hit the green lawn and died. Embers that land in the green lawn, of course, they will have no fuel around them. There's lots of moisture. If they're small, they'll snuff out. And surprisingly, the middle image, we have conifers, and you'll see they're brown on the forest side. So they clearly got scorched, got a lot of radiation. They've actually shielded radiation from the house. Wouldn't recommend planting that tree necessarily or so close, but it shows vegetation shielding radiation load on a building. A bushland example from the Hurstbridge area. This family has modified the bush out to about 50 metres. What they've done is reduce the vertical continuity of fuel by removing the shrub layer by hand. So on the left is what the site looked like. On the right is the finished result. That contains lots of native grasses and orchids and lilies. And there's a further zone of intense management near the house, but this is essentially modifying the bush to retain its integrity as much as possible when the plants and animals are looked after. The final case study is my place. It's 14 years. So I'm showing you this to show you that it's not a journey. Gardens aren't static. So 10 years into the piece, we built a pergola to carry our vines. If that was fully involved in fire, it's too far away from the house for flame length or radiation to impinge. On the right, you'll see we've replaced all of our timber steps and walls with either steel or rock, and we've used some concrete in some areas. But we've also used the gravel path against the wall and other paths with toppings to break up the garden beds, the fuel continuity horizontally. We've also pulled out shrubs, vertical fuel continuity, if you like, and we've kept the plants small, such as this is not an Australian native, it's African, I believe. Great little succulent that you can just snap off and throw in the garden and it starts a new life. Great when you've got no soil moisture and terrible soil like we do at Warrandyte. We've been able to exploit some really small native ground covers like the native violets, the kidney weed. They happily creep along amongst the grapples. If you could get them to burn, they produce very little flame and energy. I'd say to be a struggle, but it gives you greenness where you might be lacking. Similarly, small wallaby grasses we allow to wander around, quite ornamental, but they're only about 10 centimeters high. I share with you this image because this garden's mature and plants mature. Our little friend Acacia cognata is this nice little compact thing when you buy it. It is for a few years, but it becomes a small tree. I've under-pruned it, but now it's actually at the height of the eaves and it's a candidate for full removal. It's an ongoing process, and I'd have to negotiate approval to get that tree removed, but it's on my list. We've discovered some great little ground covers that give you foliage and flowers, particularly the Banksias, but also small tufting plants give you colour and ground cover that's quite small and very appropriate garden areas that are close to the house. We've also exploited water features, including a stormwater treatment pond down the slope, and the plants basically find their own way there, so it's pretty easy to do. So it's a bit of a journey. I want to conclude with a couple of take-homes, and we'll revisit these no doubt in the panel. The first point to make is that bushfire smart gardens and hardened houses together maximise the likelihood of house survival. But even with an older house, the garden will make a difference. Thinking about how big is this defendable space, 30 metres around your house matters and is really worthwhile looking at. I really want to say here that it might be something that you might think me a moonscape, but bushfire gardens can be really beautiful and peaceful, and they can hold the things that you value. They can express your identity. I also believe you don't have to be a bushfire or garden expert to build a landscaping for bushfire. You really just need to go out and observe and make small changes, and therefore you don't need a lot of money. And the last point before I close, a bit controversial. You think of fuel as vegetation, but it can also act as radiation shield. It can moderate wind speed, and in the case of the green belts like the irrigated lawn, can prevent a surface fire from progressing. So that's it, folks.
Thank you, Owen. I found that really useful myself, and I'm sure lots of our viewers did as well. That CFA landscaping book is available as a PDF, and that's free.
Thank you, Owen. That was excellent. My name's Andrew Laidlaw. I'm a landscape architect. Been in the industry for nearly 40 years, working at the Botanic Gardens, but have also worked in many rural properties for private clients. And yeah, what I'm really interested tonight in expressing is how through good design and good design process, we can not only have a beautiful garden, but we can have a garden that actually works for us in bushfire areas and actually helps us in circumstances which would otherwise could cause problems. So what I'm really wanting to encourage people to do is don't think just because we're in a bushfire zone, we have to go ground zero. In fact, we can think very carefully about what we love and what we value, and we can bring that with a fire lens to most projects, which is really quite exciting. And the first principle is really stick to a design process. So what's really important is that we do stick to a process. And the first part of any design process is developing the brief. And this is carefully, if it's your own garden or if it's the garden of a client, you really try to understand what it is that they value and what it is that they love about their garden. And that's where we start this process. And that's really important. Now, It will be a different garden if it is in a high fire prone area, and we will bring the fire lens to that. But I hope in that process we don't lose what is very important to the people that are living in that garden. Living with fire, and as Owen touched on, we live in a country that has not only adapted to fire, but has had fire as part of its community life, as part of its cultural management of landscapes for thousands and thousands of years. So it's really interesting, but as landowners and as garden owners, I feel we need to be less fearful of fire and embrace living with fire. And this comes to my point of making sure that when we are in these high fire zone risk areas, that we're doing the best we actually can. But you know, the other thing that's become very popular is just that people sitting around fire, and community happens around fire. So I'm really, you know, it's an interesting notion that a lot of people are wanting to invite fire in, but obviously we don't want catastrophic fire. But we do have a relationship with fire. So anyway, the most important part about our process, we start with the brief, and then the next most important thing is that we go through our site analysis and we actually examine very carefully where our garden sits in the landscape. What is its microclimate? Is it a coastal garden? Is it in the hills? What is the topography? What is the fire front? Where is the fire likely to come from? Where are our views? So this first part of any design is taking in all of this information before we start designing the garden. And I would like to point out that it's often this arrangement of the landscape and the vegetation has a much greater impact on how our landscape responds in a bushfire, much more than the flammability of plants, for example. But when we are working in fire areas, I point to these four main things that our designs must work with. And this is embracing our values and what we're hoping to get out of the garden. But we must look at creating defendable space, remove flammable objects from around the house, break up fuel continuity, carefully select, locate, and main trees. And if we have this holistic approach, then our gardens will really perform for us and maybe save a life, or maybe give us some time that we otherwise might not have had if we hadn't thought this process through carefully. So we have to be design specific. All of our gardens are different. All of our landscapes are different. All of our wants and wishes are different. So as landscape designers, we try to bring all of this together. But when we bring a fire lens to it, it does change what we're going to do. It changes the way we articulate the landscape. And that's very, very important. So it's not that it is mutually exclusive to the other things that we're trying to achieve. It's just that we're bringing a fire lens. So we must really know on our site where that fire front is going to come from. We must look at issues around different points of access, emergency access onto the site, more than one access onto the site. If we have the opportunity of, in this design process, of being able to site the house, then, you know, we have a much better opportunity of building a relationship to that, to the defendable space and the fire front. We need to look at things around water and where water is going to be accessible for firefighting, but also where is water going to be placed on the site. We've talked about having defendable space, but again, I bring us back to this point of we make sure that our garden is for us and we're achieving what we're really setting out to want. So there's just some basic, we dig deeper into our fire principles and we provide separation between plants vertically and horizontally. We break beds up with lawns and paths. We use gravel mulches and hard surfaces, non-flammable. Keep our garden irrigated. Moist plants are far less flammable, but these beautifully green lawns, as Owen has already pointed out, make a huge difference, particularly on that fire front side. We look, and I'll look a little bit more closely, but tonight is not about going through the specific plants, but looking more carefully at the sort of groups of plants that would be more fire-wise plants for us to choose. We look at the articulation of things like swimming pools, tennis courts, orchards, in their relationship to everything going on the site, but also in relationship to that fire front. We also look, and again, Owen touched on this, but we look at our hard surfaces, but also our fences, our hard materials, and we look at non-combustible options wherever we can. And things like wood storage, like sheds, we try to make sure that they are way outside of our defendable space and any possibility of increasing greater fire risk to the residents. So yes, I was involved with the CFA and working with Owen on putting together a number of different model gardens that work with all of those principles that we talked about. And when we're looking at model gardens, we chose 4 or 5 different types of gardens, and I'm not going to go through every one of them tonight, but it's very clear that if you're living down the coast, you have a very different circumstance than if you're living up in the Dandenongs. And soil moisture, for example, is an example of that. So we try to increase our soil, we improve our soil structure to actually increase its moisture holding capacity. So when we irrigate it, the moisture will be held in that soil structure and produce a much more moist growing environment for the plants, which is ultimately much more desirable for a landscape during a fire situation. Just pointing out here, what we have is all our hard surfaces are basically from the house in that defendable space. We've got hard paved surfaces. We've got that open lawn area. We have our garden beds broken up. We have a specimen tree for ember attack. And then we have our orchard and our vegetable gardens, which will all be irrigated on that fire front side of the house. Any plant material that we bring in to that defendable space, in this case, might be pots that we could wheel out during the summer period or move, or that we're using just very low succulent plants. And again, all the mulching would be gravel mulching. So this is just looking at that plan view of how we're using gravel right through that space. We're working with a low retaining wall, which could be a protector of radiant heat if people are caught in the house. But I would put it out to you that this garden would be an actually very beautiful garden to live in, but it actually responds to where it is by having all of those things in place. So the plan just gives us that clearer indication of the things we're trying to achieve. So this is more a hills garden. These are generally on the fringe of peri-urban areas, can be up close to bushland, but more likely are prone to attack from a grassland fire. So again, basic principles still apply that are the same, where we're looking at reducing and creating a defendable zone, which has very reduced plant material. Can still, in this case, we've used very low evergreen hedging. A lot of our car parking and gravel surfaces are on that fire front side. And we have the tennis court, the home paddock, and the orchard, which would all be irrigated again on that fire front side. Vegetable gardens, grape growing, sheds, fire storage is all well away from the house. And again, this just points out in plan just how we're bringing access into the house. We have the dam again positioned on that fire front side with the tennis court. But again, from a landscape design point of view, there's no compromise here. This would be a beautiful garden to be living into and would allow us to really achieve most of the things that we'd want to have in any garden. So I'm just going to move into some examples, real-time examples of gardens, some of which I've worked on, some that I haven't, but this is a garden in Spain. Again, defendable space, hard surface, gravel mulch, low planting, but a lot of succulent plants that really hold their moisture. And the garden beds are all broken up, so we're getting that separation. And then we've got these large specimen trees planted into particularly beyond the garden into the fields, but basically for ember attack. And again, here we've got the lawn against the house, the low planting, sort of in that 10-metre defendable space, all the vertical separation with the trees and the pruning of the trees, and the garden beds are broken up. you'll get sick of beautiful gardens. Again, this goes to plant selection. We have a specimen tree here. It's a eucalypt, but this was a remnant tree on site. We have low hedging, we have the open lawn, and we have a smooth trunked tree. And it is pruned up so that we've removed the separation. We've got firewise planting. That's Rhagodia, which is the low ground cover, has very high salts, which is one of those plant attributes that actually creates less flammability. So again, just a living example of a garden where we've got the dam on the fire front side. We've got the large specimen trees in irrigated lawn, and we have a low retaining wall, which could be, won't be damaged during a fire. It might be slightly damaged, but it'll be holding up, and it could provide a small place for fire protection during or from radiant heat. And again here, Owen touched on it, but here's the use of a large internal stone wall. Plants broken up. We've got steel fencing, all masonry structural work, so nothing that would be flammable in that situation, and also opportunities for protection from flammable, from radiant heat. All areas are irrigated, and this is in a rural environment. So plant selection is also important. Again, this garden shows the example of that hard surface being paved right up to the building edge. We could introduce pots here, but we've used plants that are basically succulent plants or plants that are full of water. We have a specimen tree that is pruned up, not an ideal tree. It's an olive which has oils in it, but it's well pruned. So we've got that that vertical separation. And so again, placement of furniture and the use of different types of furniture. We have the fire pit here, which is placed well away from the house, just in case it catches on fire or embers from that are part of that fire. But we have that irrigated lawn, paved surface up to the house. Shrubs are all kept well away from the house and using just low ground cover material up close to the house. This is an example of where we've used a gravel surface, but we've been creative and that we can use it as a bocce game. And we're using plant material here, which is really well irrigated and healthy. There's a mix of succulent plants and some other foliage plants here, but it's just a good example of using that open gravel surface, which can be used in terms of domestic uses within the garden. So again, just trying to think creatively with our hard surfaces, how we can actually work with those and they can become part of the fire landscape that we're working on. Again, these are just examples of trying to work with materials creatively. So when we're designing gardens, we go through this design process and we talked about the brief, we talked about the site analysis, and then we come into the articulation of the spaces, but we also come to selection of plant material. Not plant material, but the selection of various materials. And here we have a bluestone paver, a bluestone stepper moving onto gravel. We have a steel frame, which has a climber, albeit, but the climber would probably disappear, but the frame would actually remain. And it's just a creative use of that material, which is bringing the design to life, but still maintaining our fire lens. This is in the Mornington Peninsula. Again, an area here where we've used the lawn and the hard surface up close to the house. There is a little bit of planting over there, which probably shouldn't be there. But the other thing here, we've used a rock mulch, and we've also tried to use quite a bit of separation even between the plant material. So it's not that sort of really thickly planted shrub area. And we also have the pool, which is on that fire front side of the garden. Again, just creative use of hard surfaces. So again, design is actually working with detail in these situations, and we can actually be quite creative with hard surface. We're just breaking up the shapes and form here. Again, probably that low planting on the right should be really minimalised. It should be just succulent material. But on the left-hand side, we work pretty hard to increase that defendable space a little bit and work with a range of some succulent plant material, but again, a stone gravel mulch here just to increase that defendable space. So, you know, not all people have the sorts of money to spend on landscapes like this, but again, views are incredibly important to make sure that you have eyes on that approaching fire, and that's very important. And we always work that with the fire lens, and this is an example of where that garden is open to that north side, that northwest side. We've positioned the swimming pool, the hard surfaces, and the lawn right up to the house front. We have a large specimen tree coming up onto that right-hand side. So again, just sitting under the surface is this really strong fire lens on this garden. Hard retaining wall. Then we look at separating furniture. We look at using non-combustible furniture. We've got a steel pergola here. We've got no climbers on this pergola, and we've got a hard surface. So again, looking at that fire lens, we've got a specimen tree. We're looking again at the fire front straight ahead of us. Again, low planting, using steel furniture, using a different type of decking material, hard surfacing here, and that view out into the landscape, pruning up our trees, having our specimen trees. So I know I'm sounding very repetitive, but I'm trying to also present examples here where people can really make their gardens shine within the context of these fire zones. So this garden, which I showed at the start, but we've used a fire break at the front. We've got all hard surface. We've got stone paving, and we've also used vertical separation and garden bed separation. Again, you wouldn't look at this house with a great sense of fire sense, but from a landscape point of view, the low planting, the hard surfaces, the small garden beds that are broken up, no planting against the house. So what we really are suggesting here is that once we articulate our landscapes and we really work on those 4 basic principles, we can really create a much safer environment for our landscapes and create landscapes that are really exciting to be in. And then I feel like if we get that part right, the next thing is we go down deeper and we start to work with the plant material that we're going to use. And as Owen's already pointed out, many plants have different attributes that actually make them more desirable or less desirable to use in plants for Firewise gardens. But the limit is still enormous. And we look at some of our fleshy foliage plants, our succulent plants, even some of our native plants, which can be succulent. That one down the bottom is a native salvia or plectranthus. It's actually a good fire-resistant plant. We want to obviously avoid fine foliage plants, which have increased surface area in terms of texture, and we want to reduce that barky, flaky bark. But there is an enormous amounts of plants, and in our planting design, I really encourage people to work with plants that you're using the form and the texture and the color of plants together, but with a Firewise lens over them, and you really can create some incredibly attractive pictures with our plant material. So the fact that we're working in fire areas does not limit the sorts of planting design that we can achieve in our landscapes. So I just want to point out that obviously I've been involved in the CFA landscaping for bushfire, but there's many local communities that have lots of information. It's also really important to obviously connect with local neighbours, and there's lots of information that you get from people just gardening in the same area as you, and particularly in response to fire that have been there for longer periods of time. But I really do encourage people to reach out to work with designers or to become designers in themselves, go through a process, plan the garden carefully, and I think you'll find that you can really achieve some fantastic outcomes that are gardens that are both beautiful to be in, but are also going to help us in times of extreme weather and fire. So really that brings me to an end for what I want to say tonight, and I'm looking forward to chatting more with Owen and taking any questions that you might have. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That was terrific. Again, give me lots of ideas. We're going to just do a short BRI promo. We'd ask that you encourage your friends and community group families that you're involved with who are living with bushfire risk to register to become a BRI subscriber. And that's bri.org.au/reg. And that'll mean that you get notifications and information that comes out periodically. As well as that, please follow our Facebook page and share our posts. And we thank the numerous groups and individuals around Australia who are doing that, getting the message out to their contacts and their networks. We have a feedback survey, and we'd ask that you complete that feedback survey. It'll be emailed to you. Your comments, they're important to us, but they also help other people because it gives a sense of what everyone's doing, and they certainly guide us in providing what it is that people want. So we really ask that you complete that survey. We'd ask that you consider making a donation, and we're really grateful to the increasing number of people who are showing their appreciation by making a donation, and that is available on our website, and you can simply do it through the QR code. We've touched on some issues here that have been raised in many of our webinars before, and that hazard of bark mulch near a house or a shed comes up all the time, and people deciding what they're going to do. It's freely available. They want to use it. It's useful in all sorts of ways as mulch, but it creates that issue of a smouldering torch near a building and so on. Owen, do you want to begin the discussion with what we should do about mulch?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. It is very, very common, and it makes sense, doesn't it? The good thing about mulch, though, is it actually helps with the soil structure. Andrew touched on this. If we can keep moisture in the soil, our plants will be more resistant to fire. Our lawns will actually be quite powerful. So we need to keep some mulch, and Andrew suggested stone, but I know if you look at some really creative solutions, I've seen at the botanical gardens in Cranbourne, seashells. So there's all sorts of interesting effects you can have with different kinds of mulch. Certainly stone's a winner. The other observation to make quickly is that even if your mulch catches alight or smoulders for a time, provided it's far enough from the house and other flammable elements of the garden, it doesn't matter if it burns. It just reinforces the critical importance of this separation idea. Your garden will be full of flammable elements, but they are separated from each other and the house. Another thing I could say is that if you put the mulch on early in the season, let it decompose, that will carry less flame in front.
Sometimes with mulch, it can create a hydrophobicity with the soil. So it's actually often about the moisture. So what people do is they think they put the mulch on and they don't water those areas, and that with the mulch and that increased organic matter, it can actually make the soil quite hydrophobic, and it actually rejects moisture. So sometimes what can help the mulch is just that consistent irrigation. And I know people don't want to splash lots of water around, but if you're in a very high fire area, getting your water regime right and consistent irrigation in that defendable and fire front area will also help the mulch decompose a little bit and keep a little bit of moisture in it. But a lot of people just turn off the water. We then get 6 to 8 weeks of no water, and the mulch then becomes incredibly dry, and the soil underneath becomes dry as well. So anyway, it's just that irrigated areas also should be talked about in reference to the mulch.
Oh, and one of the things I notice strongly in the presentations is in walking around your garden, and I've had the privilege of walking around it with you. There's plenty of natives, and you're proud of them, and you protect them, and you introduce them, and so on. When I was looking at Andrew's photos, there were a lot of exotic off those ones that are sort of architectural, beautiful shapes, and tall shapes of leaves or the succulents. How should we deal with this balance between not natives versus exotics? And I guess it goes with trees. Are there sensible ways of doing it?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I'll start with the plant flammability attributes that we showed photographs of before. So it never asks the question, does it come from Australia or from overseas? It just simply says, what's the branching pattern? How small are the leaves? What's the bark like? So you can have poorly performing natives and poorly performing exotics. So it really doesn't matter where they come from. The most important thing is just to look at the flammability attributes. There are some native plants that are very good structurally from a visual perspective. There's some really good native plants that retain a lot of moisture, that have good structure, but the same could be said of exotic. So it just doesn't matter where they come from. It's how it performs is the trick. And in some settings, it's about avoiding weeds if you're near bush. But I like what Andrew said about the idea of a conversation with the client about values. So what do you value? Do you value the bush stuff, or do you have a collection of roses? And you work your design to protect those things that you value. So you can have your natives, you can have your exotics.
Andrew, do you want to add to that?
I would like to add to that because I totally agree with Owen on this, of course, and you could have a rose bed that's separated and well watered, and roses themselves aren't particularly flammable, I don't think. But the misnomer here, Malcolm, is that there are many native plants that actually hold moisture, are succulents, and are structural. We have this beautiful plant called the Guyma lily, Dorianthus excelsa, Dorianthus palmeri, an incredibly interesting plant, very lush green, very architectural. And we have our good old pig face, which is, there's two different types of pig face, but there's a beautiful little pig face called Dysphyma, and it's just a complete flat structural. It looks beautiful and structural, but it's only about 25 or even 10 centimeters high. It's stunning. So you just have to do a little bit more work. And again, it comes back to the values of what people are wanting. I'm always working with clients and always interested in trying to get the best out of my plants. And adding that fire, flammability, non-flammability is just another boundary we put around some of our selection. But we never want to compromise the design of putting our plants together. And there are lots of native plants that can perform for us.
Let's move over to some questions from our viewers. And there's one here that I guess it comes back to what you were saying about, can you keep something and how might you treat it? This person says, can I keep a well-pruned shrub or a tree to 3 meters height next to the veranda? Owen?
I don't know that I can really help with this one. That sounds like a risky proposition if the veranda has lots of timber elements. So if that shrub gets involved, and it's right next to those timber elements, it could transfer the fire. You could try and keep the fire out of that shrub, so the pathways and gravels and paving, but it looks like it might catch alight, whatever that shrub is. I think if I can just quickly go to, if you've got something really valuable that's very flammable, I can't think of an example off my head that would make sense, but let's just say you've got something that's got very fibrous bark. I don't know, a paper bark tree. Not a good idea in your defendable space. But if you wanted to keep it, you could under prune the branches, lifting them up to the 2 meters. You could run some gravel around underneath it. So work out what you value, and the chances are there'll be a treatment you can apply to keep that treasured shrub or tree by what you do underneath it and immediately around it, isolating it.
Exactly. Let's say, for example, I saw a beautiful tilapia today, Owen. Stunning, you know, and again, good large green leaf, but it was right next to the house. But sadly, would be a problem. But you know, stunning tree. So again, if you isolate it, you prune it up. There's possibly it's a decision you make, isn't it? But you give it its best opportunity.
Yep. Can I just add one last thing? In my place, we've removed lots and lots of shrubs. Things are really valued. And certainly my partner was very upset about the prospect of it going. So what I've done is I've planted the same species further away. And after about 2 years of vigorous growth, so this was a coria and a grevillea, I was able to say, look, these are pretty well established now. Can I take these out? And we have. So what do you value? What are your strategies to keep it? Sometimes that involves starting again somewhere else in the garden and then removing the offender that's against your house.
This person has asked, what are the common mistakes that people make when landscaping in fire-prone areas? Presumably they're making some changes, but they end up being major mistakes.
Yeah. It's a big bucket of potential errors, but I think broadly it's relying too much on the low flammability and not thinking enough about that separation. So flammability, we hear about fire-resistant plants, fire retardant plants. There are lists, they do exist. So we imagine that that's really all we've got to do. But that bigger leap, the really important one that's, in my view, often missed, is this separation, the breaking up of the fuel continuity. So I'd like to leave it as broad as that. There's probably other little things, but I reckon that covers it. Andrew, do you have anything to add?
Look, I think it is a lot of things, but I think you know, again, choice of hard surfaces, decks, pergolas against the house. I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer. It's not a compromise in terms of what you're trying to achieve, but steel furnishings, those sorts of things, just often, you know, we all love a deck. We don't all love a steel deck, but you know, there's just such great products around these days that, or hard surfaces, as in stone paving. Yeah, it's good, but there's a few things, and particularly just that it's so easy, that defendable space, but it's so often, because most gardens don't start with a process. They start organically, and I love that idea. But if people could actually sit down and think about those 4 or 5 principles, then they're not that hard to build in at the beginning of the process. Much harder when you get to the point where you have to make hard decisions, like Owen talked about, when you have to cut down, you know, a small eucalypt that you planted, which looks stunning, you know, because it's you know, 2 meters out of from your window. So if you begin at the beginning with some of these principles, they're quite easy to include, but difficult to retrofit sometimes.
Lots of people value Bergen for its environmental, you know, natural values, but we know it as petrol bush in some places. What's the best way to manage it in relation to your buildings?
For people who aren't familiar with Bergen, if you're from interstate, you'll have your equivalents in other parts of Australia, probably the world. It's a tea tree, a large one. It's got flaky, fibrous bark, tiny leaves that are closely held together. It branches low to the ground. If you put it through the CFA plant selection key, you'd come out as don't have it in your garden. But it is indigenous to the area that we live in here. It has habitat value for birds. Fantastic white flowers in summer. It's just a gorgeous flowering session. So what I would do if I had a Bergen thicket on my block, I've just got isolated ones, is you would thin them out. You would cut them down close to the ground. You would paint neat Roundup on the wound to stop it resprouting, because it will resprout. You might under prune some of the ones that are left. You're going to the isolation. You are keeping it where it's safe to do so. In other words, if it's fully alight, it's far enough away the radiant heat and flame length won't touch your house. If you've got a lot of them, you're going to thin them. You're going to remove them out, cut them off at the knees, at ground level, and treat with Roundup to kill it. You don't need to do what Parks Victoria did, which is bulldoze it, flatten it, and then put a fire into it. I'm talking individual plant removal.
Bergen is a major problem. It's a pioneering species as well. So when farmers have cleared land and they've left it or what have you, it just comes back incredibly fast. And then ultimately, I suppose the eucalypts and some of those larger species are meant to, in time, succeed it, and it'll finally find its own place. But we've destroyed the balance so often. So Bergen, as Owen points out, is quite a beautiful plant, but it is an absolute fire hazard. And just like Owen suggested, I have copses of it around my property, and I'm mindful where area's been cleared, that when it comes up, I'm careful to remove it. But I coppice it and I paint it with the Roundup and do the same thing. And in a couple I leave, because it's so spectacular just before Christmas. It heralds in the sort of Christmas period, and it's just part of the natural cycle around here. But it's about trying to find a safe balance with Bergen, I find.
What's the best way to deal with stringy bark if you've got an abundance of it? Are there ways that you can manage it?
Public land managers, some councils have used a technique called candling, where the individual trees are basically burnt in the right weather conditions, and that removes the fresh bark and leaves a charcoal black behind. And it's very difficult for the surface fire to travel up the stringy barks. But we're not all firefighters. We don't have that option. So stringy barks in the larger landscape, you're kind of stuck with that. They're going to produce the embers. If you've got them in your garden, I would suggest that unless you can candle them, you're probably looking at thinning some of them and replacing them with the smooth bark eucalypts. That's really your only option with the stringy barks. You can do some things like ember filtering with radiant heat shields, shrubs to catch some of the embers and what have you, which is reducing the load on the building. So that's sort of accepting you've got your stringy barks, but I'm going to deal with the ember load by what I put between it and my house. Andrew, anything else?
No, not really. I think you've covered that, Owen, and it's not an area I've had a lot of experience with. But by stringy barks, you're referring to mesmate, peppermints, which are very common in the Yarra Valley, for example, and are an indigenous remnant trees and things. Yep. So they have to be treated with huge respect, and but again, not be part of your defendable space. So I find I've got some on my property that are well away. But yeah, they're magnificent, beautiful trees, part of our landscape. So, but I wouldn't be planting them as a domestic tree close to the house or in my defendable space, or even within my property.
If you had the option of planting some trees that were going to assist with ember attack, what would be some of your preferences for that, Owen?
Yeah, so it's the structure of the tree that's working here for the ember filtering. There's also the trunk actually is shielding a portion of the radiation to nearby assets. So it's more about the form. But for me, what I would be choosing for trees are anything that has the tightly held bark. So in the native world, it's the iron bark here in Victoria. But our sycamores and aces, some acacias like lightwood and blackwood, anything where the bark is held tightly, you can't rub it off with your fingers, is terrific because it can't travel up the bole of the tree. So beyond those attributes, in a sense, it doesn't really matter if it's an oak or a native in terms of filtering and wind speed moderation. Some people have called for the use of exotic trees only, but that doesn't guarantee a good result in a bushfire. It's those spatial relationships. It's about how you manage them, the under pruning.
I'd like to add a couple of things there, Malcolm, but there's, the brachychiton is an amazing Australian native tree that has a very smooth green bark. It's got a large fleshy foliage. I think it'd come out pretty well.
Come out pretty well. Yep.
And it's a stunning tree. There's the Backhausia or the lemon myrtle. Again, it's probably got oils in it, actually, if I'm thinking about it, but it's a stunning evergreen native tree. And then there's endless numbers of exotic trees, but one that people might like to think about, because I also like to bring our climate assessments here as well, in that we don't want to be planting trees that require huge amounts of nurturing or water to grow, because it's important that these trees grow reasonably quickly and then provide us the protection that we're looking for. And some of the old classics are oaks and liquid ambers, and some of the even beech trees and things like that, but they take an eternity to grow. But there's a wonderful tree called the Persian ironwood, which is a parodia, which is a beautiful, quite fast growing exotic tree. Yeah, so look, there's a many, and the maples that are mentioned, they're very fast growing. They can really provide that protection very quickly. So there's a huge number of trees that I think can fill that void for us.
Yeah, I think like we've used maples around our house up close, and the great thing is the speed that they grow. And I think for raising that, Andrew, you don't want a tree that's going to take forever to give you the protection benefits you're seeking.
Yeah.
So that's a really good criterion. Is it going to be a good performer with your soil and climate?
Here's a question from 2009 bushfires, and certainly I've got some country like this. This person wants to know, what fire-resistant plants can you use to revegetate an area of bush on private property badly burned in 2009 fires? The area is still bare and barren with a lot of fallen dry timber.
If it is a matter of restoring the bush, then it should be using the species that are there. And if they're not regenerating by themselves, that sounds a little bit unusual. So you'd be looking for the kind of species that are part of that ecosystem. Can you select within that list of species that are native to the spot things that are less fire prone? Perhaps a little bit to some extent. But really, those bushland restoration areas are about the indigenous species. You're not creating a cultivated landscape as such, as a caution there. Hopefully, this bush that's not going so well is at a distance far enough from your assets that you can let it do its thing or add some plants. That separation is really important. Andrew, I don't know if you can elaborate more on that.
Spot on, Owen, about you have to unpack a few things. We'd have to ask a few more questions about what they're really trying to achieve, because if we're wanting the indigenous plants to come back, then obviously we're using that palette of plants. You might be able to manipulate that a little bit, Owen, and use goodenias and maybe goodias and some things that are a little bit more fleshy and green. But if you're wanting that revegetation to come back, then you've got to look at your separation and how that's not going to, because by its nature, it's going to have some issues of flammability around it. So yes, I'd need to unpack that a little bit more. Of course, if we're looking at a mixed range of species or a mixed range of even native species, we could come up with a range of plants that would be more suitable. The other thing that sometimes, if we go back and they're wanting re-veg, sometimes they have to disturb the soil a little bit more. I wonder whether there's been either compaction or some ash layer, or whether it's sometimes after fire we'll get a lot of acacias and the legumes, Bergen. Sometimes it's a matter of disturbing the soil a little bit more and seeing if you can crack open a little bit of a seed bank. But things like Prostrantha, Lasianthus, Goodenias, there are some plants there that could be suitable.
I'm glad you raised the idea of soil disturbance, Andrew, because it sounds odd that this area hasn't regenerated.
Yeah.
So something's going on there. Sorry for the poor person that wrote that. It's a great question, but it's quite complex to unpack in a few minutes on a webinar.
My experience after 2009 was that there was a huge amount of activity, all sorts of things, seeding that in fact aren't there now, 15 years later. They came, they did their thing, and then they changed. Lots of them just died and fell over, and they've left other things. So it is odd that something would still be bare I wonder whether the local land care group might be able to offer some insight into that local area too.
Yeah, great suggestion, Malcolm.
This is a question that you've already touched on, but it says, I have seen green mown grass not burn near houses in bushfires in 2003, 2006 and 2020. I read an article in the Weekly Times about green mown grass being considered a green fire blanket. Do you know the research on this or where I could find it?
Okay, yeah, look, I have seen it with my own eyes. So those photographs I showed you of the green lawn around the house in the forest, that was a photograph I took while I was working for CFA. And so I've seen it, and I've seen the black embers in the middle of the green lawn. I'm not aware of any research. There may have been, but I'm satisfied as a professional working in this field for nearly 18 years. It works. The only other thing I'd add to it is we don't emphasize its use enough. You see, even with landscaping for bushfire, we talked about plant flammability and separation. But let's explicitly go to green belts. They absolutely work. Keep them moist if you can. It's amazing the effect that it has. So sorry, I can't point to the research, but I can reassure you it totally works.
Andrew, do you want to add anything?
Nothing further to add there, only that, yeah, I feel like there's proof in the pudding, but no, nothing to really add from a research point of view. Also have a massive cooling effect for us. So anyway, I feel like there's a lot of good reasons to have them.
This is a good question. The CFA Bushfire Landscaping Guide is helpful. Beautiful examples. Looks expensive. How does it align with council programs like Gardens for Wildlife or mandatory local species planting requirements in cost-sensitive new developments? These sometimes seem at odds. Can residents realistically satisfy both?
Yeah, I think Andrew, it was clearly a message you repeated through yours. You know, looking at it from a designer's perspective, is you can have it all, and certainly use of Indigenous plant material. You can have it in a formal architectural setting, no problems there. The landscaping for bushfire allows you to test the flammability of the plants that you're considering or you already have. It gives you some hints about maintenance for each. If you use the plant selection key, it will tell you about maintenance for the plant you're studying. So worth checking that out. Since its publication, this book has been adapted in Western Australia. Certainly, I'm aware of one there. Surf Coast Council have actually produced one of their own, so localising it with species indigenous to the Surf Coast Shire. So it's highly compatible. It doesn't preclude people doing their landscaping as part of a planning permit or their biodiversity conservation. That's not precluded. You use those principles and the plant flammability stuff, and you're way ahead of the game. Andrew?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think some of the bell ratings and some of the are at odds to our wildlife corridors and some of our. So there is some challenges there, but not in what the book is saying. I think it's completely complementary to the wildlife corridors and use of local species. I would like to mention that I'm sorry if things look expensive because I'm in that landscape market. It's kind of, and I hate that because good principles, as you've pointed out, Owen, and shown in your property, they're actually not expensive to apply. You can design your own garden. It doesn't have to look that swisho and smart. Defendable space can be gravel, lawn, some edging that can be, it can be very simply done. So I'd hate to think that cost factor looks and becomes a problem for people. Just make that as just wanted to make a comment on that.
Last question, just quickly, because we're going to run out of time. Is there a list somewhere of native plants that are fire resistant, at least to a certain extent?
Yep. Okay. Well, I'll go back to what I've done before, which is to say it doesn't matter where the plant comes from. It's about its attributes. So we now know that there are natives that are appropriate. And I'm really glad of the question because when the Royal Commission was held in the Victorian fires, there were lots of submissions about plant lists and people have requested them. Can we have them? when we did our literature review for the landscaping project, we looked all over the world at flammability, scientific published papers, and our academics came back with the view that publishing a list was dangerous and misleading because you're missing out on the contextual stuff, separation, maintenance, values, Andrew, site assessment, that sort of stuff. You couldn't just produce a list and people shouldn't rely on them. So there probably are lists out there. There probably are native plants that are, I know some land care groups have promoted things like the use of the pig face, lightwood, Acacia and Plexus. They do exist, but plant lists are problematic because it does not do the complete picture.
So that sounds like a major takeaway for me anyway from this is you've got to go to context and the attributes of the plants, no matter what the list is that you're getting them from.
Can I just add one thing there, Malcolm?
Yes.
Because lists are dangerous because people, once you create a list, people will then come back and say, well, that didn't work or this caused this. And so we've avoided lists in some ways. But I do want to point out in the guides, there are quite a lot of recommended plants in some of those designs, Owen, and there's a good mix of native plants. It just doesn't come as a list. You've actually got to go into the context of the written material, but you can pull out as many native species as exotic species there. And I would just really encourage people to give it a go. And if, as again, Owen's pointed out, but if you look at those attributes and you look at a native, don't even care if it's native, but if you're going to go to a native nursery, then look at those attributes. And if you think a plant's got them, and it's not hard to pick a succulent plant, then I would give them a go and really experiment a little bit. But there are some embedded native plants listed in those guides. You've just got to work a bit hard to find them.
All right. Thank you for your contribution. We're going to need to finish on that. I'd like to thank our sponsors again and support us, the Bendigo Bank Community Bank branches in our local area, the Resilience Canopy, the CFA, Country Fire Authority, the Warrandyte Riverside Market, Davey Pumps, the City of Manningham, and Nillumbik Shire Council. And thank you to Owen and to Andrew for creating a terrific webinar. And thank you also particularly to Rowan for, again, being our host and making things work for us. And also I'd like to acknowledge our BRI team, who you can see on the screen there, and particularly to Max Garner, who is our secretary, but so much more than that, in making these webinars happen and keeping up our contact with just so many people, our presenters and organisations and so on. And all of those people on the screen for their commitment in conducting and promoting the webinar series and maintaining our website, which is growing all the time. A special thank you to Tammy Garrett of the CFA, who responded to the questions online, and of course again to Rowan from District 14 CFA. Thank you to all of you for attending, and good night.